This is the story of some of the people who helped to build Worfield from the earliest times to 1900. The talk was given in June 2024 at St Peter's Church, Worfield. Worfield's story, and to clarify, I'll be talking about the parish or the manor of Worfield. The area is actually the same. So the history of Worfield begins around 8000 BC, when hunter-gatherers walked across land from what is now mainland Europe before the English Channel was flooded. They left legacies in the landscape, footpaths, hollow ways, and they left behind some of their stone tools. These have been found at Hermitage Farm, Burcote, Udness and Hockham. But I guess that anywhere you looked in the parish, you would find flints or stone tools. They've only been found in these particular areas because people have looked. Many a farm worker will have caught a nice flint with their hoe as they were hoeing a field, the flints tinkling as the hoe caught them, and probably picked up the most interesting and beautiful arrowheads as the attractive objects they are. The late Frank Taylor was poking around rabbit holes at the end of Clive Ridge in Shipley and found over 400 flints, beautifully crafted and shaped to specific purposes. As time moved on, other waves of people came across from the continent, including the Beaker people from 1500 BC, who brought the skill of making bronze, providing more effective tools. After the Beaker people came the Celts from around 750 BC, in what we now call the Iron Age. And we can identify two tribes from coins found locally. The Dabuni, meaning dark-haired people from the southwest, and the Corioltavi, people of many rivers from the east and northeast. Dabuni coins have also been found in Worfield. The third tribe we know from the hill fort they built at Chesterton in the northeast of the parish. The tribe came from Chester. They herded cattle, traded in salt, and were very wealthy. And they're known all over Shropshire for their hill forts that they built. For example, at the Wrekin, Oswestry, Titterston Clee. But Chesterton is probably the least well known of the hill forts and sadly has received very little archaeological attention. The fort is over 27 acres in extent, well defended by steep slopes on three sides, to which the Cornovii added ditches and embankments on which may have been walls, hence the name the Walls. Go in winter would be my advice, when the landscape features can be more easily seen. As good a defensive site as Chesterton was, it was no match for the Romans, who arrived 43 AD, and the Celtic period gave way to a Roman one, which lasted until 410 AD. There is no doubt the Romans were here. There are metal-detected finds aplenty to prove it. Roman coins replaced the Celtic and are regularly found. The military buckle is more of a rarity, and the pottery the same. But what else? What was their legacy? Did the Romans use Chesterton Fort as a marching camp? We can't be sure. Did they build roads around Worfield, or in many cases just improve existing ones? Who knows? Did they build villas or farmsteads? And if so, where? High Grosvenor, Chesterton perhaps? Did they build the church at Chesterton? That's quite a thought, and it's quite a possibility. What we do know for certain is that they changed our diet, and in consequence what we grew, not on farms but in gardens. They brought ground elder, cabbage, leeks, onions, turnips, garlic, pepper, basil, thyme, greater celandine, apples, pears, cherries, plums, and damsons. And they also brought rabbits, pheasants, and brown hares. The power vacuum after the Romans left encouraged others to come and chance their arm. 600 years in which Vikings, Angles and Saxons, to say nothing of the nearby Welsh Celts, came overland and up the Severn to this area, either simply to take spoils or stake a claim on the land. There were battles we know of nearby, at Quatford 897 and Tettenhall in 910 AD. And in 1001, Bridgnorth was occupied by Sven Forkbeard and his Viking army. There must have been defences all over the parish, and Wulfric Spot, son of Lady Wolfram, is believed by one antiquarian, William Hardwick, to have built a fortification at Hallen, reusing an Iron Age hill fort, perhaps. It was the Saxons who prevailed, and out of this turmoil emerged Worfield, a place with the same name as one in Germany, rivers called the Churl and the Wurf, and a pattern of settlement more or less as we have it today, predating Saxon perhaps, and they laid solid foundations for a safe, sustainable, cohesive society with laws and judicial practices, many of which have continued to today, the jury system, for example. Each one of Worfield's villages, 29 or thereabouts, would have started out as a single farmstead, with enough land to feed a family. And as the villages grew, the land needed to be shared between households, so was farmed in strips, in 3 open fields, in a 3-year rotation: grain, peas and fallow. As boys became men at the age of 12, they were sworn into the community of Worfield. And every month, the good men of Worfield would report to the 100 Court in Seasden 100, perhaps at Penn, at St Bartholomew's Church, because before the conquest, Worfield was in the 100 of Seasden. It was also in the county of Stafford and the kingdom of Mercia. For the next 400 years, Worfield would continue to look east, to Treasil, Seasden and Womben. Metal-detected finds within the parish include some beautifully crafted items, and from nearby Pattingham, the coin and the gilded mount from just down the road at Swindon, and of course the Saxon hoard was found near Burntwood. Earl Leofric, the Earl of Mercia, the husband of Lady Godiva, ordered the building of Worfield Church, which was part of the Diocese of Lichfield and Coventry. I wish I could tell you more about what early Christianity was like in Worfield, but it's not easy. The Reformation has destroyed so much evidence. South of the River Worth, the parish was in the Forest of Morth, a royal hunting forest, which stretched from Kinver to Willey, a forest not as we define the word, but more of a chase for pursuing deer into enclosures. There were changes after the conquest, but perhaps not as many as you might think. King William replaced Earl Alfgar as Lord of the Manor with his own man, Hugh of Montgomery. Worfield was moved into the 100 of Brimstree and the Shire of Shrewsbury. The church remained in the Diocese of Lichfield and Coventry, and forest laws were imposed in the Forest of Morth to prevent poaching, the theft of wood and overgrazing. But it is the Saxon people who will build Worfield, and the Celts, not the French, of whom we can only identify the Garberts or Gerberts, who may have been Flemish, and Nicholas the French in 1406. The system was the same as before the conquest. The master was different. 1066 to 1500 are what we call the Middle Ages. Hard times, wars aplenty, harvests subject to the vagaries of the weather, and disease subject to the will of God. The Black Death left the manor scarred for a very long time, with farms untended and houses without occupants. But for good or ill, we are an enduring species, and even in the bad times, and in the Black Death there must have been some very bad times, the manor courts were still held every 3 weeks, heard in English, recorded in Latin, rolled up for ease of handling. These are the manor court rolls of Worfield. We learn more about those who have done wrong, of course, than the law-abiding, but it takes all sorts. We learn of husbands who beat their wives, of women who keep brothels, those who eavesdrop on their neighbours, assault each other, and fish illegally. We learn of Walter and Joan of Kingslow, who were found guilty in 1330 of felony, taken to Shrewsbury Castle, and didn't return, of course. Of Edith and Marjorie Stevens, who 100 years later had acquired an astonishing array of goods by theft by the time they were arrested. We learn about Nicholas Lightfoot, who stole a horse and was hanged at Wycombe in 1421, and about Thomas Bullock of Alvescott, a travelling salesman who was convicted of stealing in 1455 in Buckinghamshire and hanged at Aylesbury. It may surprise you that people travelled so far, but they did. John Stanlow is described as of Bristol in 1458, and the most likely reason, of course, is that he was part of the wool trade. William Rowley died in Bordeaux in 1478, and he was a merchant venturer, also from Bristol. Was he one of our Rowleys? I can't be sure, but I would like to put a bet on it. The English economy ran on wool, and Worfield was no exception. We see it in the surnames: the Webbs, the Weavers, the Walkers, who originally walked on wetted cloth, pounding it to tighten the weave, the tailors and the drapers. We see the shearers at work, 3 men and 1 woman hired in 1480 to shear the sheep of William Clark of Wenlock, from the Ville of Kingslow until the Marsh, wherever that was. And we see it in the number of fulling mills which sprang up on the Worth and the Churl, and they leave behind some of their prized possessions. A hoard of coins, surely indicative of wealth, if nothing else. A harness pendant, which would have been gold and many other colours, and which would have glinted in the sun and jangled as this gentleman rode by. Keys and spindle whorls. And now we have the names of some of our builders. Roger of Udness, Roger the Gold. Was he blonde? Richard the Forester of Roughton, William Wormod, Thomas Merriwell, William Ingebrand, and Richard Ingerman. I want to explore something here. The last 2 names, Ingebrand from Worfield and Ingerman from Newton, surely must be of Viking stock. Could it be their ancestors who produced the Worfield picture doors? Claverley has its murals, Worfield the only pair of such doors dating from the 12th century in the country, and only 5 in total which have survived. They are special because they are the first examples of decorative ironwork. The doors were found in an outhouse at the vicarage, and they've always been thought to be church doors, but I wonder if this is so. In the 15th century, a man stole 2 doors from the lady's house, which I take to be the lady of the manor's house. Yet according to a survey of the parish done in 1399, there was no manor house in Worfield. So was it by then dilapidated and forgotten about? And could these be the doors of a lost manor house? Which begs the question, where might the manor house have been? Well, probably not where you would think, and certainly not where I would have thought. I would have put the location as somewhere in Worfield village or in Halland, but just across the road from Worfield, there is a footpath which leads up to a wood called Chemsel, which had always struck me as a rather odd name. Extend the word to its full, and it should actually be Chemmer's Hill, the chief messuage or house hill. As it sits next to the Lord's meadow, it makes perfect sense. Surely the manor house was somewhere in this location. So here we are in the 16th century. The Reformation came and made sweeping changes, but the question was how it affected Worfield. Well, firstly, the monks had to go. They lived opposite the church and may have been elsewhere in the parish. We simply don't know. Secondly, the rectory, known as Lower Hall, patronage of the church, and with it the rectoral tithes, were all sold to Sir John Talbot of Pepper Hill, Lord of the Manor of Albrighton in 1540. And it was the Talbots who built or significantly improved the rectory, which in recent years has been restored to its former glory. Thirdly, the Worfield lost its chantry chapel, which had been in St Mary's Chapel, to the north of the main aisle of the church. Supported by gifts to sing masses for the souls of the departed, chantries could build up considerable wealth, but whether this was the case in Worfield, I don't know. Sir John Lye was one of the last chantry priests. He lived next to St Peter's Well, and his tombstone lies in the floor in front of St Mary's Chapel. Fourthly, Worfield Church lost its embellishments. Prior to the Reformation, the walls were painted. Statues draped in lavish robes were dotted about. Huge gold crosses were suspended above St Mary's Chapel and the chancel. It was a spectacle. After the Reformation, the church was much more plain. Walls whitewashed, statues and elaborate altar tables smashed. So permit me to introduce you to George Bromley, who was quite a figure in the Reformation, a man who held many state roles, including Steward of the Crown Lands, 1554, Chief Justice of Chester, 1580, Member of the Council of the Marches, Church Commissioner, 1572, Keeper of the Rolls, 1574, Attorney General of the Duchy of Lancaster, and MP for Bridgnorth, and resident of Worfield. And here is the memorial to him and his wife, a memorial which must have looked strangely out of place in this now Protestant church. George wasn't actually from Worfield. With the name Bromley, you might have thought he came from the village just down the road, but he actually came from Hodnett and came here because he married Jane Wannerton, née Barker, who had inherited land and property in Worfield through her mother, Alice Barker. The Barkers had built up quite an estate in Hallam, and they lived in this house, which was just off the road from Hallam to Catstree. But there is hardly a trace of it now. The reason for this will soon be apparent. 1600 dawns, no doubt, with the usual celebrations. But little do the good people of Worfield know, but their world is about to have a very big shake-up. It's not the Civil War I'm talking about here, nor the new lords of the manor who took over in 1634. Thomas Whitmore and his father-in-law John Weld. No, this is one of those tiny events which were to have big consequences. One night a man was riding back to his home in Cheshire and got lost in Worfield. He stopped to ask the way and was put up overnight at the Bromley home, where he met and fell in love with a beautiful girl by the name of Jane Bromley, the granddaughter of George Bromley. The man's name? William Davenport. Jane Bromley's father had died, and her mother had, after his death, married Walter Wrottesley. Neither of them were impressed with Jane's suitor, and they took her to live with them at Wrottesley Hall, where she could be better protected. The plan failed. William and Jane eloped and were married in 1603-4. And then the trouble started. Court cases issued from William like a man possessed. Firstly, a case against Jane's mother for money, huge amounts of money, against Peter Gifford for land in Hallam, and against Edward Bromley for possession of Bromley land in Worfield. William is successful in taking hold of the Bromley land, and Edward Bromley, who thought he'd inherited it and was happily living in Hallam, was the loser. Alongside the memorial to George Bromley is this much larger one to his brother Edward, which shouldn't really be in Worfield Church at all, because after Edward lost the estate in Hallam, he moved to live in Shifnal, and the memorial was intended for Shifnal Church, but they refused to have it. Worfield was offered it and accepted. The Civil War caused mayhem. Worfield was not exempt from all the turmoil. It had to protect the crossing of the Severn at Bridgnorth, so defensively it was important to hold the parish for the Royalists. And apart from the locals who had to fight, troops had to be quartered. And all the while there were people crossing the parish, often injured in battle and trying to get home. One hoped they didn't die on Worfield soil, and sometimes they were taken by cart or on horseback to the next parish, lest they became a burden on the parish here. The Whitmores were staunch Royalists, and pro-Royalist meetings were held at Apley. When Bridgnorth fell to the parliamentarians in 1645, the Whitmore estate was confiscated, and Apley was sold to Roger Rowley, a parliamentarian. I love to reflect how different life might have been had it stayed in Rowley hands. It was not to be. After the Civil War, Apley was restored to the Whitmores, and the Rowleys returned to their farming and malting interests. A fascinating family, here since Saxon times, I would imagine, and still farming in the area. We started the century with the Davenports, and by the end of it, they are still acquiring property. This time, the rectory and the Wyken estate in 1696, which you will remember had been sold to the Talbots. It seemed like a bargain when Henry Davenport bought it, but soon he found it wasn't quite as he thought. The estate was mortgaged up to the hilt, encumbered with debts, and horror of horrors, the poor of Worfield leased the rectory garden. Beside himself with anger, Davenport tried every way he knew to prize the deeds from the vendor, but George Talbot was a slippery character, and eventually presented Henry with a box which he said contained the deeds, but which conveniently mice had eaten. The one thing Henry thought he'd got out of the deal were the rector's tithes, but even there he was thwarted. He was high-handed with the good folk of Worfield, and they took a dim view of it. Take Widow Beddoes of Bromley, who was in the field stacking a good harvest of carrots. The Davenport agent came to collect his master's due. The agent started to build a heap for the Davenports, and Widow Beddoes said, "Oh, no, you don't. You're not having them," and put them back on her pile. Ever fond of litigation, Davenport took the case to the court in Lichfield, but it was Widow Beddoes who won. Enter the Indian connection, the man who shouldn't have inherited Worfield estate at all, Henry Davenport II. He was the second son of his father Henry, and it was only because his elder brother Sherrington died that Henry came into this inheritance in 1719. Up to this point, Henry had been destined to spend his life as a merchant. He'd made a fortune with the East India Company, as so many of the local landowners, such as the Pigots, did. His behaviour was probably no better and no worse than the rest of them, but perhaps that didn't say very much. Anyway, he returned home with a vast fortune from his dealings, stayed in London and traded in diamonds. The question for Henry, now that he had inherited, was what had he inherited? He definitely had an agricultural estate, but he was no farmer. And he'd had 2 very large houses, but both were flawed. Hallen House was tarnished by the Bromley connection, and the rectory in Worfield was, well, he didn't really know what he'd got there. The solution surely was to create his own house and surround it by a park. And so it was that Davenport House was built in 1726, designed by one of the most famous architects of the day, Francis Smith, formerly of the Works, with the grounds landscaped by William Shenstone of Halesowen. Henry died in 1731, so had only a few years to enjoy his new house. But the new house made the old Bromley house redundant, and so it was demolished. The 18th and 19th century bring us into a change in farming. The Saxon system of communal farming had served the parish well in the early days, but as time went on, more and more land was enclosed by individuals to make farms, so that by the late 18th and early 19th centuries, only common land remained open for cottagers to graze their livestock. All that changed in the period around 1800, when a number of Acts of Parliament permitted the enclosure of the remaining open land in Worfield, 1,500 acres in all, and allocated it to those who were entitled. It was the job of a man by the unforgettable name of Valentine Vickers to manage the process. And this is part of the more common alongside the Hobbins after enclosure, showing the racecourse which was lost as a consequence. People who once worked with now worked for, and the community was split into the haves and have-nots. Farmers improved their farms, and the results can be seen today in the beautiful farmhouses and barns across the parish. It was a golden age for farming. One would like to think that farm workers would have benefited as well, but that was not the case. Once fiercely independent, a large section of Worfield's population were now paupers and had to wear a badge with the initials WP if they were workhouse poor, or P if they were in receipt of outdoor relief if they stayed in their own homes. How people worked, men, women and children. Before the school was built, children were apprenticed from the age of 7 until at least 21, sometimes to 24. Most worked on the farms. Some helped with building work. Worfield's school was built in 1846 and the church renovated in 1862. Others worked in William Wood's brickyards across the parish. This is the Hilton brickyard. Many people worked on improving roads in and around the parish. This is the improved road to the ferry points and Lode at Newton. But the days when the River Severn was a major thoroughfare were numbered. This was the modern form of transport, and better roads were required. Long-distance roads, turnpike roads as they were known, from the turnpikes which were put across the road at various points so that tolls could be collected from travellers. There is only one toll house still remaining in the parish, on the A442 from Bridgnorth. And as we move into the second half of the 19th century, even the fortunes of farmers take a nosedive, so that farms are sold, farmers go bankrupt, and many leave the parish. So much so that in 1901, the population of the parish was just over 4,000 people, the same as it was in 1821. But if those who left thought they were going to fare better in the neighbouring towns, they were wrong, because this was a worldwide depression, which had started in 1873, although it hit Worfield a little later. So as 1900 dawns, we hope that Worfield's economic position improves. But how that happens is a story for another day.